Title: The Weight of Summer Rain. The first time I saw him, it wasn't under moonlight or over candlelight. It was in line at a grocery store, somewhere between the cereal aisle and the frozen section. Ordinary, unremarkable. Yet somehow, that moment changed everything. I was 35, a mother, a wife, a woman who thought she understood stability. My husband, David, was dependable, the sort of man who always came home at 6 and paid the bills on time. Our life was built on schedules, school drop-offs, weekend errands, and the quiet routines that keep a family moving forward even when the spark is gone. He, on the other hand, was chaos in human form. His name was Adam Reeves, a journalist who had just moved into town after a decade in war reporting. He carried the weight of the world in his eyes, the kind of sadness that made you want to know the story behind it. When he smiled at me that day, it felt like I had been noticed for the first time in years. It began innocently. A few casual conversations at the cafe down the street, a recommendation for a book, a shared laugh about how small towns make gossip a kind of sport. But emotional lines are easier to blur than physical ones. Soon the text came late at night. "You still awake?" he'd write, and I would stare at the glowing screen, feeling the pull of something I couldn't explain, or maybe didn't want to. There was never a grand decision, no thunderclap of realization. Just a slow drift, like a tide carrying me away from the shore of what I'd known towards something thrilling and terrifying. Adam listened in a way no one else did. He remembered details, asked questions that dug deep. He spoke about the places he'd been, Syria, Sudan, Kosovo, and each story made my world feel both smaller and more alive. But love, or whatever we called it, doesn't bloom in peace when it's born in secrecy. The guilt was a constant hum beneath every heartbeat. The fear of being seen together, the half-truths told. The ache of knowing that happiness came with a cost. Still, in that fragile summer of my life, I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't falling in love. It's realizing what you've been missing all along. Part 1. The First Conversation. The storm that night came out of nowhere. One minute the streets were quiet. The next, thunder rolled through the valley, and rain came down in thick, slanted sheets. I was closing the front window when I saw him again, Adam, standing across the street under the awning of the old bookstore. He looked drenched but strangely calm, as if he'd been waiting for the rain. An impulse I couldn't explain made me grab an umbrella and step outside. "Hey," I called out over the sound of the downpour. "You'll catch pneumonia out here." He smiled, that half-smile that always made it impossible to look away. "I like the rain. It reminds me of home, though I'm not sure where that is anymore." Something in his tone, that quiet melancholy, made me pause. We ended up walking to the corner cafe, our shoes squeaking against the tile floor as the owner handed us 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The place was empty, and for the next hour, the world seemed to shrink down to the sound of rain on the glass and the warmth of conversation. He told me about his years overseas, covering stories no one wanted to hear: famine, war, and the weight of loss that came with watching humanity at its worst. I listened, mesmerized. His words carried both pain and purpose. When he asked about my life, I hesitated. "It's quiet," I said. "Stable. Sometimes I think stability is just another word for numb." He looked at me for a long moment. "You sound like someone who stopped expecting surprises." That single sentence landed harder than I wanted it to. Maybe because it was true. Somewhere between being a wife, a mother, and the person everyone relied on, I had stopped expecting anything new, least of all from myself. The rain eased. We didn't exchange numbers that night, but something unspoken passed between us. When I stepped back into my house, the air felt heavier. My husband was asleep on the couch, the television flickering softly. I stood there for a long time, dripping rainwater on the carpet, wondering why I suddenly felt like a strange part too. Small distances. The next few weeks passed quietly, or so it seemed on the surface. I went about my days as usual, packing lunches, answering emails, smiling through conversations with neighbors. But beneath that routine, something was shifting. I began to notice small things, how my phone would light up and my pulse would quicken, even when it was just a message from the school. How every afternoon, when I drove past the bookstore, I'd glance instinctively toward the awning where I'd first seen him in the rain. It wasn't long before I saw him again. Twice in 1 week, he said, smiling as I walked into the cafe. You must like the coffee here. Maybe, I replied, smiling back. Or maybe I just like quiet places. We talked for hours again. About nothing and everything, music, childhood memories, the kind of dreams people stop chasing when life becomes too practical. He told me he had once wanted to write a novel. I told him I had once wanted to paint. We both laughed at the idea of unfinished dreams, though the laughter carried something heavier beneath it. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something subtler. A friendship that glowed faintly in the shadows of our separate lives. He made me feel seen, and that alone was dangerous. Sometimes, I'd tell myself it was harmless, two adults sharing coffee and conversation. But late at night, when I sat beside my husband watching TV, my thoughts would drift to the sound of Adam's voice, the way he listened, the way his eyes seemed to catch every hidden truth. It's strange how quickly boundaries erode. One moment you're careful. The next, you're checking in my own life. It's strange how quickly boundaries erode. One moment you're careful. The next, you're checking your messages before anyone else wakes up, smiling at your phone, erasing the evidence before guilt can find you. One afternoon he texted, "The light's perfect today. You should paint again." It was such a simple message, kind, thoughtful, yet it sent my heart racing. That evening, I dug out my old paint set from the attic. The smell of old oils and dust filled the room as I set up a canvas by the window. For the first time in years, I felt something like joy, not because of what I was doing, but because someone had reminded me I could. As the first brushstrokes met the canvas, I realized this wasn't about love, not yet. It was about being alive again. Part 3. The Edge of Something. It was late September when the days began to shorten, and the air took on that quiet, golden sadness of early autumn. The rhythm of my life looked the same from the outside. School drop-offs, work calls, dinner on the table at 6. But inside, something had changed so completely I could no longer ignore it. Adam and I had fallen into a pattern. We'd meet once or twice a week at the cafe, or at the park near the river where the willow trees leaned into the water. Sometimes we didn't talk much at all. We'd just sit there, watching the current move, as though the silence itself was saying everything we couldn't. He asked me once, "Do you ever feel like you were supposed to live another life, but somehow ended up in this one by accident?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him how often I'd looked at my reflection and wondered when I'd stopped recognizing myself. But instead I said, "We all feel that way sometimes." He smiled gently. "Maybe. But some people get tired of feeling it." After that, we didn't meet for a few days. I told myself I was being responsible, pulling back before things went too far. But when I saw him again outside the bookstore, the way my heart reacted to, I was already far past the point of control. He handed me a book. The Great Gatsby. "You said you never finished it," he said. "You should." I took it, brushing his hand by accident. The moment our skin touched, I felt something like an ache, not lust but recognition. Two people who had both lived too long pretending not to want more. That night, I read the book cover to cover. The story of longing, of missed chances, of people chasing something just beyond reach. It felt too close, too real. I cried quietly in bed, careful not to wake David. In the days that followed, I began to notice small things that frightened me. The way my husband's questions suddenly felt like intrusions. The way my phone felt heavy in my hand when Adam didn't text. The way happiness had started to come with a shadow. One evening, as I stood by the window watching the rain fall, I realized that I was standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. Something that could destroy the life I'd built. And yet, for the first time in years, I didn't feel numb. I felt alive.